The first time I heard the low-frequency hum coming from the abandoned copper mine, I thought it was wind trapped in the tunnels. That was 12 years ago, in the autumn of 2011, when I arrived at the Bitterroot Selway Wilderness in Montana as a wildlife documentation specialist for the Forest Service. The mine had been sealed since 1987. Its entrance collapsed and marked with federal warning signs that had faded to ghosts of red and white. But the sound, that deep resonant pulse that vibrated through your chest cavity before reaching your ears, that was no wind. I was there to document grizzly population recovery. Standard protocol, motion-activated cameras, hair snare stations, scat analysis. The kind of work that requires patience, solitude, and the ability to spend weeks alone in country where cell service is a memory and the nearest human being is a 2-day hike away. I was 42 years old, recently divorced, and perfectly content to let the forest swallow me whole for months at a time. The mine sat in a narrow valley carved by ancient glaciers, flanked by Douglas fir and western larch that had never seen a chainsaw. The Forest Service had designated it a restricted zone, not for public safety, but because the old copper veins still contained trace radioactive minerals, uranium oxide. Nothing dangerous in small doses, but enough to justify keeping hikers away, which meant I had the valley to myself. On my third night, I set up a camera trap near the mine entrance, aimed at a game trail where I'd found bear scat. The camera was a Reconyx HC600 military grade, capable of capturing high-definition stills in near-total darkness. I checked it every 72 hours, downloading images to my laptop, logging observations in my field journal. That's when I saw the first photograph. Not a bear, not an elk, not anything I could identify from 30 years of fieldwork across 6 western states. A figure, bipedal, approximately 7 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the infrared flash like burnished copper. It stood at the mine entrance, one massive hand resting against the collapsed timbers, head turned slightly toward the camera, as if it had heard the shutter click, despite the unit's silent trigger. The image was clear, unambiguous, impossible. I sat in my tent for 3 hours staring at the LCD screen, waiting for my brain to construct a rational explanation that never came. I didn't report it, not immediately. In wildlife biology, there's a phenomenon called observer bias, the tendency to see what you expect to see, to let excitement override critical analysis. I'd spent my entire career training myself to resist it, to document only what could be verified, measured, and replicated. A single photograph, no matter how clear, was an anomaly. It required context. So I did what any scientist would do. I expanded the study. Over the next 2 weeks, I established a perimeter of 12 camera traps in a half-mile radius around the mine. I varied the heights, angles, and trigger sensitivities. I used 3 different camera models to rule out equipment malfunction. I set up audio recorders capable of capturing frequencies below human hearing range, the infrasound that elephants use to communicate across miles of savanna. I collected hair samples from tree bark, scat from the area, and made plaster casts of tracks I found in the soft earth near a creek that fed into the valley. The tracks were the first thing that shook my skepticism. 16 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball, 5 distinct toes with visible dermal ridges, fingerprints essentially, that showed none of the telltale signs of fabrication. The depth and spacing suggested something that weighed between 600 and 800 pounds, walking upright with a stride length of nearly 6 feet. I cross-referenced every known bear gait pattern, every elk track variation, every possibility my training could offer. Nothing matched. The Bitterroot Selway is hard country. 90 miles of roadless wilderness where the Continental Divide scrapes the sky and winter comes early and stays late. The nearest town, Darby, Montana, sits 40 miles to the east, accessible only by a logging road that washes out every spring. I'd taken the position specifically because of the isolation, 3-month rotations, living in a Forest Service cabin that smelled like creosote and mouse droppings, with nothing but a satellite phone for emergencies. My days fell into rhythm. Wake at dawn, check cameras, collect data, observe. I stopped thinking about the divorce, about the house I'd signed over to my ex-wife, about the career trajectory I'd abandoned when I transferred to this remote posting. The forest had a way of making human concerns feel very small. The cameras captured them again on October 18th. This time, 3 figures, 2 adults and what appeared to be a juvenile, perhaps 4 feet tall. They emerged from the tree line at dusk, moving with a fluid, unhurried gait that looked nothing like the lumbering shuffle of bears. The larger of the two adults, I came to think of it as the male, though I had no biological confirmation, carried something over one shoulder. The infrared couldn't resolve details, but the shape suggested a deer carcass. They entered the mine. I sat with that information for 2 days, trying to construct an alternative explanation. A family of hikers in costume? Implausible. The area was restricted and the nearest trail was 12 miles away. Hoax perpetrated by colleagues? Impossible. I hadn't told anyone about the first photograph. Mass hallucination captured by electronic equipment? That's not how hallucinations work, which left me with the unthinkable. I was documenting a family group of Gigantopithecus descendants, surviving in a pocket of North American wilderness that had somehow remained undiscovered, or at least unreported, by modern science. On October 23rd, I hiked to the mine entrance. The collapsed timbers showed signs of recent disturbance, fresh scrape marks on the wood, a clear path worn through the fallen debris. The federal warning signs had been bent back deliberately by something with considerable strength. I could smell them, a dense organic musk like wet dog mixed with decomposing leaf matter, and something else, something almost medicinal, menthol maybe, or eucalyptus. I didn't go inside. Some instinct, the same one that keeps you from stumbling onto a grizzly den, told me to respect the boundary. Instead, I set up a permanent observation post 200 yards upslope, concealed in a cluster of fallen logs. I installed a long-range camera with a telephoto lens, powered by solar panels I'd requisitioned under the pretense of expanding bear monitoring. I built a weatherproof housing for my laptop and external hard drives. I brought in supplies for an extended stay, dried food, water filtration, cold weather gear. I told my supervisor I was tracking a particularly elusive grizzly sow with cubs. The patterns emerged slowly. They were most active during dawn and dusk, crepuscular like deer. They avoided the mine entrance during full moons, suggesting some sensitivity to ambient light. They brought food back to the mine: deer, elk, what appeared to be salmon from the creek, vegetation I couldn't identify from distance. Once I watched the female, I assumed smaller, more graceful in movement, carefully strip bark from a fallen larch, roll it into bundles, and carry it inside. Tool use. Preparation. They were living there, not passing through, not sheltering temporarily. Living. The juvenile was the revelation. I watched it play. There's no other word for it. Wrestling with dead branches, throwing stones into the creek, following the adults with the clumsy enthusiasm of all young primates. At one point it climbed a Douglas fir with astonishing speed, perched on a branch 40 feet up, and seemed to simply watch the valley as the sun set behind the western peaks. I started keeping a second journal, separate from my official field notes. In it, I documented everything the cameras couldn't capture: the way they moved, the sounds they made, low, rumbling vocalizations that carried through the valley like distant thunder, the social dynamics that suggested complex communication and family structure. I was no longer a wildlife biologist. I was a witness to something that wasn't supposed to exist. The first winter changed everything. I'd expected them to migrate, to follow game populations down to lower elevations as the snow deepened. Instead, they stayed. The mine, I realized, wasn't just a shelter. It was a wintering den, carefully chosen for thermal properties that old copper mines possess. The collapsed tunnels would maintain a relatively constant temperature, protected from wind, insulated by earth and rock. I watched them prepare. Throughout November, they brought in enormous quantities of vegetation. The female made dozens of trips carrying bundles of dried grass, moss, pine boughs, even what looked like strips of cedar bark. The male focused on food storage, deer carcasses dragged to the mine entrance, partially consumed, then covered with rocks and snow. Cache behavior, deliberate and systematic. By December, the valley was locked in. 6 feet of snow, temperatures dropping to -20 at night. I'd moved into the cabin, a 2-room structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1936, with walls thick enough to hold warmth, and a wood stove that consumed half a cord per week. My official rotation had ended, but I'd requested an extension for ongoing research priorities. My supervisor approved it without questions. Budget constraints meant fewer rangers in the field, and my willingness to stay through winter was administratively convenient. I checked the cameras every morning. hiking the 1.5 miles to my observation post on snowshoes. The mine entrance remained clear. They were tunneling out through the snow, creating paths that they maintained meticulously. I never saw all three at once during winter. They seemed to be rotating. One would emerge, forage for a few hours, then return. Energy conservation, I assumed. Metabolic efficiency. On January 8, 2012, something happened that forced me to reconsider my policy of non-intervention. The juvenile emerged alone mid-morning. Wrong time. They never moved during full daylight. It was limping badly, holding its left arm against its chest. Even from 200 yards through the telephoto lens, I could see something was wrong. The arm hung at an unnatural angle. Broken, almost certainly. It moved to the creek, now frozen except for a narrow channel of running water. It drank. Then it sat on the bank, making a sound I'd never heard before. A high-pitched, keening vocalization that carried through the cold air like a child crying. Neither adult appeared. For 3 hours I watched through the scope. The juvenile tried several times to return to the mine, but seemed unable to navigate the snow tunnel with only one functional arm. It kept slipping, falling, crying out. The temperature was dropping. A storm was moving in from the northwest, visible as a dark wall of cloud rolling over the peaks. This is where I broke my first rule. I approached. I packed a first aid kit designed for large mammals, the kind we used for tranquilized bears, and moved slowly down the slope. The juvenile saw me at 50 yards. It froze. Every instinct I had screamed danger. I was approaching an injured wild animal, potentially separated from protective parents who could appear at any moment. But the sound it was making, that desperate vocalization, overrode caution. At 20 yards, I stopped and knelt. I opened the kit slowly, showing my hands. The juvenile watched with eyes that reflected surprising intelligence, not the flat, alien gaze of a predator, but something more complex, wary, calculating, almost curious. I've worked with primates before, chimps in rehabilitation centers, gorillas in captivity. The juvenile's face had that same quality of cognitive depth, the sense of a complex emotional state behind the physical expression. I placed the kit on the snow between us and backed away. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the juvenile approached, moving on 3 limbs with heartbreaking difficulty. It sniffed the kit, pawed at it gently, looked at me. I remained motionless. Finally, it picked up a roll of gauze with its good hand, examined it, then dropped it and retreated to the creek bank. That's when the female appeared. She came from the tree line to my left, moving with shocking silence despite her size. 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark auburn hair that was longer and finer than I'd expected. She didn't charge, didn't vocalize, simply positioned herself between me and the juvenile, standing upright, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. We looked at each other for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she made a gesture. There's no other word for it. She raised one hand, palm facing me, fingers spread. Not aggressive, not threatening. Something else. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or warning. I backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact until I reached the tree line. She didn't follow. When I looked back from the safety of my observation post, both were gone. The first aid kit remained untouched in the snow until the storm buried it 3 hours later. That night, I made my first call on the satellite phone to someone outside official channels. Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist I'd worked with 15 years earlier in Borneo. I trusted her methodology, her discretion, and her willingness to consider data that challenged conventional understanding. I told her everything. Her response, after a long silence, "Don't tell anyone else, not yet. If this is what you think it is, documentation is secondary to protection. The moment this becomes public, that valley becomes a circus, and they become specimens." She was right, of course. But her warning came with an implicit question I wasn't ready to answer. What was I protecting them for? Science? Curiosity? Or something more fundamental? The belief that some things deserve to exist undisturbed, unmeasured, free from human categorization? The juvenile's arm healed over the following weeks. I watched it regain mobility, slowly, painfully. The adults brought it food, supported it, adjusted their routines to accommodate its limitations. I took 4,000 photographs that winter, and I told no one. Spring came late to the Bitterroot Selway. Snow persisted through April, melting reluctantly under skies that couldn't quite commit to warmth. The family emerged more frequently as the days lengthened. The valley came alive with their activity in ways I hadn't witnessed during fall and winter. On May 3, 2012, I finally saw them in full daylight. The juvenile, nearly recovered now, though still favoring its right arm, was playing in the creek, splashing water, turning over stones. The female sat on the bank, stripping inner bark from a willow branch with remarkable dexterity, using her teeth to tear precise strips that she laid out on a flat rock. The male stood guard upslope, his posture alert but relaxed, scanning the tree line with the methodical attention of someone who understood perimeters and threats. I was filming with a digital video camera, concealed in my observation post. High definition, optical zoom, image stabilization. The technology was good enough to capture details I'd missed in still photographs, the fine musculature of their hands, nearly human in structure, the way the female's face showed concentration as she worked, her brow furrowing in a manner that suggested complex problem-solving, the juvenile's playfulness so utterly familiar from watching human children that it created a cognitive dissonance I struggled to process. Then the male turned and looked directly at the camera, not at the observation post, at the camera lens itself, as if he could see through the camouflage netting, through the fallen logs, directly to the electronic eye that had been watching his family for 6 months. He held the gaze for 5 seconds. Then he made a sound, a deep, resonant vocalization that I felt in my chest as much as heard. The female and juvenile immediately stopped what they were doing. They looked at him, then followed his gaze toward my position. For a moment, all three were perfectly still, staring at the hillside where I was hidden. The male took 3 steps forward. Not aggressive, deliberate. He was, I realized with a chill, making a decision about me. I did the only thing I could think of. I stood up. I emerged from the observation post slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movements. At 200 yards, I was close enough to see their expressions change from alertness to something I can only describe as recognition. They'd known I was there all along. The winter approached, the first aid kit. They'd been observing me as carefully as I'd been observing them. The female made a gesture, similar to the one she'd made in winter, hand raised, palm out, but this time, she held it longer, then moved it in a slow horizontal motion. Go away, stay back. I couldn't be certain. I raised my own hand in response, mirrored the gesture. We stood that way for perhaps a minute. 2 species, separated by 200 yards and millions of years of evolutionary divergence, attempting communication through the most primitive means possible. Then the male did something that changed everything. He walked to the mine entrance, reached into the darkness, and pulled out an object. From my distance, I couldn't identify it immediately. He carried it to a clearing between us, placed it deliberately on the ground, and stepped back. It was my first aid kit, the one I'd left in the snow 4 months earlier. Not just placed there, returned. The male gestured toward it, then toward me. The meaning was unmistakable. Take it back. The debt is acknowledged. The boundary is established. I approached slowly, keenly aware that I was being allowed to enter their space under conditions they were defining. The kit sat exactly where he'd placed it, partially damaged by weather but clearly retrieved and stored. Inside, several items were missing. The gauze, some antiseptic wipes, a small bottle of ibuprofen. Used, I assumed, though I had no idea how they'd figured out its purpose. As I picked up the kit, I heard a sound behind me. I turned. The female was 20 feet away. She'd moved with absolute silence across terrain that should have made stealth impossible. This close, I could see details the camera couldn't capture. The intelligence in her dark eyes, the weathered texture of her skin visible through thinner hair around her face, the scars on her hands that spoke of a hard life in unforgiving country. She was looking at my camera. Understanding the question, I slowly removed the SD card and held it up. Then I placed it on the ground between us and backed away. An offering. Evidence of good faith. She picked up the card with surprising delicacy, examined it, then, and this is what I remember most clearly, she smelled it. Not just a passing sniff, but a deep, analytical inhalation, as if she was trying to understand what it was through olfactory information I couldn't perceive. She pocketed it. I saw her tuck it into a fold of vegetation she wore around her waist like a primitive belt, and made a low rumbling sound, not threatening, almost conversational. Then she did something I didn't expect. She gestured toward the mine entrance. An invitation? A warning? I couldn't tell, but the meaning seemed clear. This is ours. You've seen it. Now respect it. I nodded, spoke softly. I understand. Her eyes widened slightly. She tilted her head. And for just a moment I saw something that looked like surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to respond vocally, or perhaps hadn't expected the tone I'd used. The juvenile approached her side and she placed one massive hand on its shoulder, protective, maternal, unmistakably affectionate. The male rejoined them. They stood together, a family unit, watching me watch them. Then they turned and disappeared into the mine, leaving me standing in the clearing with a damaged first aid kit and the overwhelming certainty that nothing in my scientific training had prepared me for this moment. I had made contact with an unknown hominid species, and they had made contact back. I spent that night in the cabin staring at the ceiling, trying to construct a framework for what I'd experienced. In wildlife biology, there are established protocols for species discovery, documentation, peer review, habitat assessment, population surveys, conservation planning. The process is methodical, designed to minimize disruption while maximizing scientific understanding. But this wasn't a new salamander or an unclassified bird. This was a species that demonstrated tool use, social complexity, apparent symbolic thinking, and what looked increasingly like intentional communication. This was a discovery that would rewrite anthropology, primatology, evolutionary biology, potentially everything we understood about human uniqueness and the trajectory of hominid development. This was also a family living in a remote valley, vulnerable to every nightmare scenario my training allowed me to imagine: habitat disruption, specimen collection, media frenzy, trophy hunting, government seizure, corporate exploitation. Sarah Chen called 2 days later, using the agreed-upon check-in schedule we'd established. I told her about the exchange, the returned first aid kit, the gesture toward the mine. Her silence stretched so long I thought the connection had dropped. Finally, "You need to get tissue samples. Hair, definitely, scat if possible. Something we can use for genetic analysis before anyone else knows about this. Once you have baseline DNA, we can start building a protection framework. Endangered species designation, habitat preservation, legal barriers to exploitation. But we need hard evidence that will hold up in court. Sarah, they're not specimens. I know what they are. That's why we need to protect them before someone else finds them and treats them like specimens. You want to keep them safe? We need legal standing. And for that, we need science they can't dispute." She was right, but the conversation left me unsettled. Every collection method I knew, hair snares, scat sampling, environmental DNA from water sources, felt like violation now. These weren't subjects. They were, what? Neighbors? Colleagues in some bizarre interspecies research project? I compromised with myself. I would collect only what they left behind. Shed hair from tree bark, scat from areas they'd clearly abandoned, water samples from the creek after they'd moved on. No traps, no baiting, no deliberate interference. Over the next 3 weeks, I gathered samples with painstaking care, documenting location and circumstances for each collection. The hair was extraordinary. Thick, coarse outer guard hairs covering finer, denser underfur that suggested sophisticated thermoregulation. Under my portable microscope, the cellular structure showed primate characteristics, but with subtle differences in medulla patterns I couldn't immediately explain. The scat contained partially digested vegetation I recognized: huckleberries, wild onions, inner bark, but also animal protein and something unusual: small fragments of what looked like fungal tissue with a distinctive bluish tint. I collected samples of the fungus from rotting logs near the mine. Later analysis would suggest it had mild antibiotic properties. They were self-medicating. On May 28th, while processing water samples at the creek, I found something that changed my timeline. A human footprint. Not mine. Wrong boot pattern, larger size. Recent, probably within the past 48 hours. It came from the east, following the game trail that connected to the main logging road 12 miles distant. Someone else had been here. I followed the tracks for half a mile, finding evidence of careful observation. Broken branches positioned as trail markers. A small campfire site that had been meticulously cleaned but still showed thermal signature. Whoever this was knew fieldcraft and wanted to remain undetected. The tracks led to my observation post. They'd found it. The camouflage netting had been moved slightly, then carefully replaced. One of my backup batteries was missing. Nothing else disturbed, but the message was clear. You're not alone anymore. I called Sarah that night. We have a problem. Tell me. I described the footprints, the evidence of surveillance. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my blood cold. USGS has been expanding its rare earth mineral survey in Montana. The old copper mines are part of the assessment. There's speculation about lithium deposits in those rock formations. If they're planning core samples or exploratory drilling, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. I hiked to the mine the next morning, breaking my self-imposed rule about approaching uninvited. The family was there. I could hear low vocalizations echoing from inside the collapsed entrance. I stopped at the clearing where we'd exchanged the first aid kit and called out, "I need to talk to you." Ridiculous, speaking to beings who might not comprehend language. But the vocalizations stopped. After a minute, the male emerged. He looked at me with what I interpreted as wariness. Our previous encounter had been on his terms, initiated by him. This was different. I pointed to the tracks I'd preserved with marker stakes. Then I gestured toward the mine, made a motion of people arriving, pointed down valley toward the logging road. I was pantomiming an invasion, hoping context would convey what words couldn't. He watched my entire performance without moving. Then he made a sound, lower, more resonant than his usual vocalizations. The female and juvenile emerged. All three stared at the footprints I'd indicated. The female approached the tracks, knelt, examined them with the same careful attention I'd used. She smelled the disturbed earth. Then she looked at me and made a gesture I'd seen before, hand raised, moving in a pushing motion. Go away, or make them go away? I nodded, pointed to myself, made a gesture of barrier, protection. I was promising something I had no authority to guarantee, but the alternative, doing nothing, was unacceptable. The male made a decision. He disappeared into the mine and returned carrying something, a piece of copper ore, rich green with oxidation. He placed it at my feet, then made a complex gesture, pointing at the ore, at the mine, then sweeping his arm across the entire valley. This is why they'll come. This is what they want. He understood. They all understood. The threat wasn't just intrusion. It was extraction, destruction, the complete dismantling of their home in pursuit of resources humans valued more than mystery. I picked up the copper ore, made a promise I didn't know how to keep. I'll stop them. The next 6 months became a careful dance of documentation and concealment. I submitted routine wildlife reports to the Forest Service, carefully edited to remove any anomalies that might trigger curiosity. Grizzly populations were stable. Elk migration patterns were normal. Tree disease surveys showed healthy forest ecosystem. Everything predictable, bureaucratically satisfying, designed to be filed and forgotten. Meanwhile, I was building the most comprehensive photographic record of an unknown species in the history of biological research. By November 2012, I had documented behavioral patterns that suggested complex social structure, food sharing with apparent reciprocal obligations, cooperative child rearing where the male took active parenting roles, and what looked like teaching, the adults deliberately demonstrating techniques to the juvenile, correcting its mistakes, showing patience when it struggled with new skills. I watched the male teach the juvenile to fish. Not the crude swatting method bears use, but a sophisticated technique, standing motionless in the current, waiting for salmon to swim between the legs, then using both hands to pin the fish against submerged rocks. The juvenile failed repeatedly. The male never showed frustration, simply demonstrated again and again until the juvenile succeeded. When it finally caught its first fish, both adults made vocalizations that could only be described as celebratory. I captured it all. 47 hours of high-definition video, 12,000 still photographs, 200 audio recordings spanning their full vocal range. I documented their tool use, the female fashioning what looked like a primitive digging implement from a shaped stone and a branch, bound together with plant fibers she'd twisted into cordage. I recorded their apparent medicinal plant knowledge. They consistently consumed specific plants after eating raw meat, possibly as antiparasitics. Most remarkably, I documented what appeared to be symbolic behavior. Near the mine entrance, they maintained a cairn, a deliberately stacked pile of stones that served no obvious practical purpose. They added to it regularly, always placing stones with care, sometimes arranging them in patterns. Once I watched the female place what looked like a bird skull atop the cairn, positioning it with meticulous attention. Was it grave marker, memorial, territory boundary? I couldn't know. But the intentionality was undeniable. They were creating meaning, investing objects with significance beyond their physical properties. Sarah arrived in July. I'd requested her visit officially, as a primatology consultant reviewing my mountain gorilla comparative behavior study, a fictional project that gave her access without raising questions. She spent 3 weeks in the observation post, watching through the telephoto lens, reviewing my footage, conducting preliminary analysis of the genetic samples I'd collected. On her last night, we sat in the cabin while a summer thunderstorm rolled through the valley. She'd been quiet all evening, processing what she'd seen. "They're not Gigantopithecus descendants," she said finally. "The genetic analysis suggests they split from the human chimpanzee line somewhere between 7 and 9 million years ago, a separate hominid branch that survived in isolated pockets while everything else went extinct or evolved. They're not humans. They're not apes. They're something else, a parallel evolution of bipedal primate intelligence that took a different path. Can we protect them? Define protection. If we reveal their existence, we can push for endangered species status, habitat preservation, federal oversight, but that means permanent monitoring, research teams, grad students collecting dissertation data. Their lives become a documentary. If we don't reveal them," she trailed off, "someone else finds them. USGS does mineral surveys. A hiker gets lucky with a camera phone. A hunter mistakes one for a bear. And then we have no control over the narrative." "There's a third option," Sarah said quietly. "We document everything. Create an encrypted archive. Distribute copies to trusted colleagues with instructions to release it only if the habitat comes under threat. Treat it like insurance. Something that protects them by existing but doesn't exploit them by being public. That's still using them. Turning them into data? No. Data would be publishing. This is witnessing. There's a difference." She looked at me carefully. "But you need to decide what you're willing to sacrifice for that difference. Your career, probably. Maybe your credibility if it ever comes out that you sat on this for years. The question is whether you think their privacy is worth more than your professional reputation." I'd already made that decision months earlier in the snow, but hearing it articulated made it real. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "The juvenile is female. I could see clearly in some of your recent footage, which means that family might be the seed population for stability. Male, female, offspring. If they're truly isolated, if there aren't others nearby, we might be watching one of the last groups of their species." That possibility had haunted me since winter. I'd never seen evidence of other individuals, never found tracks or vocalizations beyond the 3 I'd been monitoring. The mine might not be a home, it might be a last refuge. "What do you think they understand?" I asked. "About us. About the threat we represent." Sarah was quiet for a long time. "I think they understand more than we want to believe. That gesture the male made, showing you the copper ore, making the connection between resource and danger, that's abstract reasoning. Cause and effect across time, that's sophisticated cognition. They know what we are. They've probably encountered humans before, maybe generations ago, and learned to hide. This valley might be their sanctuary precisely because it's been designated forbidden. The radiation warnings, the restricted access. They found safety in our fears. Lightning illuminated the valley. For a moment I could see the mine entrance, dark against the hillside. A home built in the shadow of human warning signs. "So we keep the secret," I said. "We keep the secret, and we watch. For as long as we can." The USGS survey team arrived in spring of 2013. 3 geologists, 2 grad students, and a Forest Service liaison I'd never met. A young administrator named Marcus Webb who had the efficient, cheerful demeanor of someone who believed paperwork solved problems. They established base camp 8 miles from my cabin, at the edge of the restricted zone. Their mandate was exploratory assessment, ground-penetrating radar, core samples from accessible rock faces, water quality analysis for rare earth contamination, standard survey protocol that would keep them busy for 6 weeks and generate reports no one would read. Except their survey map included the valley where the mine sat. Webb visited my cabin to coordinate logistics. He was maybe 30, carrying tablets and satellite equipment that made my field notebooks look like archaeological artifacts. "We appreciate your cooperation," he said, spreading a topographic map across my table. "Your local knowledge will be invaluable for identifying safe access routes and potential hazards." I pointed to the mine valley. "That area is unstable. Radiation levels exceed safety thresholds, and the collapsed tunnel system creates serious structural risks. I'd strongly recommend excluding it from your survey." He frowned at his tablet. "Our preliminary readings show radiation within acceptable parameters. and the mineral signatures suggest significant deposits worth assessing. We'll need to at least do surface sampling. The access is dangerous. I've had rockfalls. We have experienced mountaineers on the team. If you're concerned about liability, I can get you formal exemption paperwork. He wasn't going to back down. The valley was in the survey grid, and survey grids got completed. That was how bureaucracy worked. Momentum and procedure overriding individual judgment. That night, I hiked to the observation post. The family was active. I could see the female working near the creek, the juvenile climbing trees with increasing confidence. They had no idea what was coming. No framework for understanding that their home had become a point on a digital map, a potential resource deposit that would trigger processes they couldn't escape. I had to tell someone. But who? My supervisor would ask questions I couldn't answer. Sarah was teaching in Singapore, 7,000 miles away and legally powerless. The tribal nations whose ancestral territory included this land might have cultural authority to restrict access, but contacting them meant explaining why, which meant revealing what I'd been protecting. I made a decision I knew was unethical by every professional standard I'd been trained to uphold. I sabotaged the survey. Small things, carefully calibrated. I accidentally provided GPS coordinates that were off by 0.3 degrees, leading the team to a parallel valley with similar geological features but no mine. When they corrected the error, I mentioned aggressive bear activity, which was true, just not in the mine valley. I suggested that rockfall risk was highest during afternoon thermal expansion, which pushed their work schedule to mornings when the family was least active. I created bureaucratic delays, lost equipment manifests, misplaced core sample labels, concerns about weather windows and evacuation protocols. Nothing dramatic, just the normal friction of fieldwork, amplified strategically. Webb grew frustrated. By week 4, they were behind schedule and questioning the value of continuing. The samples they'd collected showed mineral concentrations below economic viability. The terrain was challenging. The logistics were complicated. On May 17th, they packed up and left. Webb thanked me with strained politeness. "Tough country," he said. "I'll note in my report that this area may not be worth the investment for future assessments." I'd bought time, maybe years, but the victory felt hollow because I knew what I'd become. Someone who lied professionally, who manipulated data, who prioritized personal conviction over institutional trust. Everything I'd criticized in bad science, motivated reasoning, selective reporting, putting belief before evidence, I was now practicing deliberately. That evening I sat at the observation post and watched the family emerge for their evening routine. They had no idea how close they'd come, no framework for understanding the complex human systems that had temporarily spared them. The juvenile, nearly full-grown now, maybe 6 feet tall, was practicing with what looked like a primitive spear, a straight branch with the end sharpened to a point. She thrust it at imaginary targets, mimicking techniques I'd seen the male use during their rare hunts. The adults watched with what looked like approval, occasionally correcting her stance or grip. They were thriving, learning, living, and I was complicit in keeping them ignorant of the fact that their existence was now a documented risk to human economic interests. Sarah called that night. I told her about the survey, my interference, the ethical compromises I'd made. "You did what you had to do," she said, but her tone was uncertain. "The question is what happens next. You can't sabotage every survey. Eventually someone will notice the pattern, the anomalies in your reports, the consistent barriers to accessing that specific valley. And when they do, they'll ask why. So what's the alternative? Let them find the family? No. But we need a better strategy than you playing guardian forever. This isn't sustainable." She was right. I was one person, in one location, with limited authority and a finite career. I was 45 years old. In 20 years, I'd be retired or dead. Who would protect them then? "There's one option we haven't discussed," Sarah said carefully. "Contact. Deliberate, documented, careful contact. If we could establish communication, real communication, not just gestures, we might be able to negotiate, teach them about human institutions, threats, the systems they're navigating blindly, give them agency, or terrify them, break their trust completely. Maybe. But right now you're making decisions for them without their knowledge. Is that any better?" I didn't have an answer. I spent 3 months preparing. Not equipment. I had everything I needed for that. I was preparing myself, wrestling with the fundamental question, Did I have the right to force awareness on beings who had survived specifically by remaining unknown? In August 2013, I made my decision. I approached the mine at dawn, carrying no cameras, no recording equipment, just myself, unarmed, moving slowly through the morning mist that clung to the valley floor. I stopped at the clearing where we'd exchanged objects before, the space that had become our de facto meeting ground. I called out, "I need to show you something." Silence. Then movement in the trees. The male emerged first, alert but not aggressive. The female followed, with the juvenile, now nearly adult-sized, close behind. All three watched me with expressions I'd learned to read, curiosity mixed with wariness, the same look you might give a neighbor whose behavior had suddenly changed. I sat down, gestured for them to approach. After a moment's hesitation, the male moved forward, stopping 10 feet away, close enough for detailed communication, far enough to retreat if needed. I pulled out a tablet computer, the same one Webb had used to show me survey maps. I'd spent weeks loading it with images, photographs of cities, highways, industrial sites, aerial views of strip mines, clear-cut forests, dammed rivers. I'd organized them into a sequence that told a story: wilderness before, destruction during, abandonment after. I showed the male the first image, an untouched forest, similar to this valley. Then the next, the same location with roads carved through it. Then, heavy equipment, fallen trees, exposed earth. Finally, the devastation complete, the land reconfigured for human use, every trace of the original ecosystem erased. He studied each image carefully. His expression shifted, subtle changes in the muscles around his eyes, the set of his jaw. He understood. I could see him understanding. The female approached, looked at the screen over his shoulder. The juvenile pressed close, making a low sound that might have been distress. They were seeing their future, rendered in high definition. I showed them more: protest movements, conservation areas, protected lands with boundaries marked and enforced. Humans who fought against the destruction. Legal frameworks, however imperfect, that sometimes preserved what remained. Then I showed them the valley. Not my photographs, satellite imagery I'd pulled from public databases. Their home, seen from space, a green pocket in the larger wilderness. Beautiful, isolated, unprotected. I pointed at the screen, then at the land around us. Same place. Then I cycled back to the images of destruction. The implication was clear. This could happen here. The male made a sound, deep, resonant, that reverberated through the clearing. Not anger, something more complex. Grief, maybe, or resignation. The acknowledgement of a threat too large to fight. I showed them one final sequence. The mine entrance, photographed from multiple angles. Then images of survey equipment, geologists, the kind of human activity that preceded extraction. I pointed down valley toward where Webb's team had camped. I showed them the timeline of threat. First surveys, then assessments, then decisions, then machines. The female reached out and touched the screen. Her finger, massive, calloused, impossibly gentle, traced the outline of the mine entrance in the photograph, her home reduced to pixels. She looked at me with eyes that held something I can only describe as exhausted knowledge, as if she'd known this moment would come eventually, had perhaps been running from it for longer than I could imagine. She made a gesture I hadn't seen before, both hands pressed together, then separated slowly while maintaining parallel orientation. Division? Separation? Or something else? A question about what came next. I responded by showing them my field journal. Page after page of observations, sketches, notes. 12 years of documentation. Then I showed them what I'd done with it. Encrypted files, distributed to trusted colleagues, with instructions never to publish unless the habitat was threatened. I was trying to explain insurance, protection through documentation. Whether they understood the specifics, I couldn't know. But I think they grasped the core concept. Your existence is recorded, but the record is locked away. The male made a decision. He stood, walked to the mine entrance, and emerged carrying something wrapped in bark. He unwrapped it slowly. A collection of objects. The SD card the female had taken from me years ago. Several of my equipment batteries. A lens cap I hadn't realized was missing. Items they'd collected, borrowed perhaps, or taken as insurance of their own. He returned them to me carefully, one by one. Then he did something extraordinary. He took the tablet from my hand, studied it for a moment, then made a gesture of closure. Hands open, then brought together, fingers interlocking. Enough. No more documentation. I understood. They were agreeing to the bargain. I would protect them through silence and sabotage. In return, I would stop watching. No more cameras, no more surveillance. They would trust me to stand between them and the human world, but only if I stopped treating them as subjects. I nodded, deactivated the tablet, made my own gesture, hand to heart, then extended toward them. A promise. The female approached. She placed one massive hand on my shoulder, the first deliberate physical contact between us. The weight was significant, but the touch was gentle. She held it there for 3 seconds, her eyes meeting mine. Then she withdrew, gathered her family, and they disappeared into the mine. I sat in that clearing until sunset, holding the returned items, understanding that I'd just negotiated a treaty between species. Informal, unrecorded, completely unenforceable, binding nonetheless. I dismantled my observation post the next day, removed every camera, every piece of equipment, restored the site to natural appearance. The family watched from a distance. I could feel their presence without seeing them. When I finished, I raised my hand one final time. I thought I saw movement at the mine entrance. Acknowledgement, maybe. I never photographed them again. For the next 11 years, I kept my promise. I lived in the cabin during field season, conducted my official wildlife surveys, submitted predictable reports. I stopped using the observation post. I deliberately avoided the mine valley except for rare visits when I felt compelled to verify they were still there. Brief hikes where I left no trace and took nothing away except the relief of knowing they survived another season. The juvenile matured into an adult female. I saw her occasionally at a distance, moving through the forest with the same cautious grace her mother possessed. The male showed signs of aging, gray in his coat, a slight limp in his right leg. The female remained vital, apparently taking on more of the foraging and hunting duties as her mate slowed. They thrived in obscurity. No hikers reported strange sightings. No hunters came back with impossible stories. The valley remained restricted, forgotten, a bureaucratic footnote in Forest Service territory maps. I published papers on grizzly behavior, elk migration, forest ecosystem dynamics. I became a respected, if unremarkable, field biologist. Colleagues knew me as thorough, careful, slightly antisocial. Nothing unusual for someone who chose remote postings. Sarah and I maintained contact, speaking in careful euphemisms about the project when we communicated. She never pressed me for updates. The agreement was implicit. Some things remained unknown unless they needed to become known. In 2019, there was a scare. A private mineral exploration company purchased survey rights for the broader region. Their maps included the valley. I prepared for another round of sabotage, interference, the ethical compromises that had become routine. Then something unexpected happened. The tribal nation whose ancestral territory included the land filed a lawsuit challenging the survey rights on cultural preservation grounds. They won a temporary injunction, then a permanent protection order. The valley became legally restricted, not for radiation concerns, but for cultural significance. I later learned that Sarah had contacted tribal elders years earlier, describing the valley as a site of profound ecological and cultural importance, without explaining details. She'd planted seeds, provided legal strategies, connected them with environmental lawyers. The protection came through indigenous sovereignty, not federal endangered species designation. It was brilliant, jurisdiction that couldn't be overridden by mineral rights or economic interests. The family never knew they'd been saved by legal mechanisms they couldn't perceive, but they were safer than they'd been in decades. I retired from the Forest Service in 2022, at 55. Younger than typical, but I'd accumulated enough years for a modest pension. I moved to Missoula, 2 hours from the valley but close enough to return when needed. Sarah visited that spring. We hiked to the cabin together, her first return since 2012. "Do you regret it?" she asked, keeping them secret. Losing the chance to publish the most significant biological discovery in a century. I thought about it carefully, about the professional recognition I'd sacrificed, the Nobel Prize that would never come, the textbooks that wouldn't feature my name, the scientific legacy reduced to routine wildlife surveys. No, some things are more important than being known for knowing them. That's very Zen. That's very practical. The moment I published, they stopped being a family and became a resource. Specimens, data points, I chose their privacy over my reputation. I'd make the same choice tomorrow. We hiked to the mine valley one final time. The entrance was as I remembered it. Collapsed timbers, warning signs faded to ghosts, no evidence of the extraordinary life that continued behind it. We didn't approach closely. We simply stood at the tree line and watched the valley in silence. Then I saw movement. The female emerged. Older now, her coat more gray than auburn, but still powerful, still graceful. She paused at the mine entrance, looked directly toward where we stood, and raised one hand. The gesture I'd seen a decade earlier. Acknowledgement. Recognition. She knew we were there, had probably known we were coming, was making a choice to be seen one final time. Sarah gasped softly beside me. My God, she remembers. They all remember. That's the thing about intelligence. It carries memory, context, relationship. We're not strangers. We're the ones who kept the promise. The female held her position for another moment, then turned and disappeared into the mine. The valley returned to stillness, indistinguishable from any other wilderness landscape. Beautiful, unremarkable, hiding everything that mattered. We hiked out as sunset painted the peaks gold and crimson. At the trailhead, Sarah turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. You know they'll eventually be discovered. Maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually. Someone will be in the wrong place with the right equipment, or the family will grow, spread out, become impossible to hide. I know, but that's not my decision to prevent. I bought them time. Let them live in peace for a few more generations. That's all anyone can do. Protect what matters for as long as possible. Then trust others to make better choices than we feared they would. That's optimistic. That's realistic. The alternative is despair, and despair helps no one. We drove back to Missoula as darkness settled over Montana. Behind us, the valley disappeared into night, a pocket of ancient mystery preserved by silence, indigenous sovereignty, and the choice of one man to let wonder exist without exploiting it. I kept detailed records. Everything encrypted, distributed among trusted colleagues with instructions to release only if habitat destruction became imminent. Insurance, not publication. Protection, not prestige. The government never erased my footage because the government never knew it existed. They couldn't erase what they'd never found. The real erasure was my choice, to remove myself from their story, to let them remain what they'd always been, free, unknown, surviving in the margins we'd accidentally left them. Some secrets aren't discovered. They're entrusted to those who understand that not everything needs to be known. The forest keeps its promises. So do I.